a LiSTNR production.
A warning. This episode contains graphic descriptions of violent crime. Please listen with care. One night, 4 crime scenes, 32 gunshot wounds, 8 members of the same family slain in their homes. 2 years later, a local family of 4 are arrested for the crimes. These are the events now known as the Piketon Massacre, Ohio's most notorious mass murder. Today, we dive into the chilling details with Joseph Scott Morgan. Known for his insights on high-profile cases, Joseph brings his deep expertise to this now infamous investigation. In this episode, we explored the forensic intricacies of the Piketon case, the twisted familial connections, and what this case reveals about the impact of violent crime on society. My name's Kathryn Fox. I'm a former GP, crime author, and screenwriter. I'm enthralled by forensics and have spent thousands of hours researching for books and screenplays. So I thought, why not turn my research into a podcast? Every week, you'll be joining me in discovering how forensic science is helping solve high-profile crimes in Australia and around the world.
The Pike County murders is something that really struck a chord with me. I think because I'd never seen anything like it, having worked in 2 major metropolitan areas in the U.S. I'd had multiple homicides that I'd worked, but nothing like that, nothing that even began to approach this. And I got invited by a dear friend of mine who has a production company in L.A., and she said, look, we're going to do this podcast on this topic. And it wound up being the #1 true crime podcast in the U.S. for a while. And the name of it was the Piketon Massacre. And it certainly was a massacre because you had just kind of the nuts and bolts. You had 2 families that had lived in this very isolated rural area. It's in the mid-Appalachian area of the U.S., so the spine of the Appalachian Mountains that kind of start up in Maine and run all the way down here to Alabama. It's in Ohio, very isolated. People live a hand-to-mouth existence. Very proud people. They scratch a living out, doing anything, farming, handiwork around landscaping, any way that they can make a living. They try to do as much stuff in cash as they possibly can, I think. And of course, in any kind of environment like that where you're having to provide for a family, you have to do whatever's necessary. And so both these families are involved to a certain degree in marijuana grow operations. And so you had that happening. There was even, they had involved themselves in the world of cockfighting, which is still a thing, just like dogfighting is. And they were separate from the rest of the community, essentially. They all went to church together, or at least the kids all went to school together. They would see each other at the farmer's market. So long story short, what essentially happened is that one family, 4 members of one family, took it upon themselves to eradicate the other family. And so one night, I think it was 2016, in Pike County, Ohio, one family put together their own hit squad, and they went to, and just take the measure of this, 4 separate locations in one night and killed 8 people. I'd never seen anything like this. I've had cases as a practitioner where I would walk in and it would be a mass homicide, where I'd have, 6 people, 8 people dead in a house, but all confined to that one space. Never anything like this, because for me, it showed, from a forensic standpoint, it was very purposed. We kind of quipped about this a couple of times. I remember we wound up doing a documentary for Peacock for NBC Universal. We were sitting around talking. It's like, what do you say after you go to the first scene and you gun down 2 people in that house? What's the conversation like in the car when you're going to the next scene? Is it dead quiet? Do you talk about, well, your aim was really bad. We didn't bring the right weapons. What's that conversation like? Because now you've done it once. You've killed 2 people. Now you're going to go to the next location where there are 2 small children in a mobile home, and you kill both of the parents. And there's essentially a newborn baby in between 2 of the parents in bed. And when the police finally get to that child, the child is covered in its mother's blood, alive. It's been wallowing around in it. The 3 or 4-year-old child that's also in there sleeping on the sofa. And when his aunt came to the door, she was banging on the door, trying to get access. The little boy looks at his aunt and says, Daddy's playing zombie. Then you go to the next house. You kill 3 people there. And then there's one that's about 7 miles away. You have to purpose yourself to get there. I went to all of these different scenes with the documentary that I was involved in. And this guy lived in isolation in what the Brits call a caravan, this tiny camper that had a homemade porch that was built. It was not movable. And he just lived a singular existence out there. And he, again, was one of these peripheral family members that was involved in the grow operation. But as it turned out, marijuana had nothing to do with it. Cockfighting had nothing to do with it.
There was mention initially of Mexican cartels and things like that potentially being involved.
Yeah, and the roads that run through there, they thought that it was a hit squad that had come up from Mexico or some other place. And not to bury the lead, but this turned out to be over a child custody issue. So you eradicate 8 members of another family over the custody of a singular child. For me, I guess just as a human, it was really hard for me to take the measure of it. And I've seen a lot of violent stuff. It was just the methodical nature of it all. The one family that made up the hit squad, the mother/wife, it was her 2 sons and her husband that were doing the shooting. She stayed behind to babysit the child that was in question over the custody issue. And she had planned all this stuff. And dig this. She knew enough about what we did at scenes that she went to, I don't think you guys have Walmarts in Australia, but Kathryn, she bought shoes for her husband and her sons to wear that were purposed to only be worn that night so that they didn't leave any footprints behind that could be traced by wear patterns. How audacious do you have to be to do that? Of course, she couldn't avoid the CCTV where she's caught on camera purchasing the shoes, but nonetheless, she's thinking about this.
This was 2 weeks in advance too, wasn't it?
Yeah,
she bought that at somewhere that will sell how many of these cheap pairs of shoes? They're probably ubiquitous.
Yeah, and the thing about it is how this got solved was quite amazing relative to just the shoes alone. This young lady that was working at the state crime lab in Ohio couldn't make sense out of what she was seeing because they had one footprint that was left in blood, and she's like, kind of scratching her head over it. So she decides just on her own to go to Walmart's and start looking at shoes. And I'll be damned if she didn't hit on this thing immediately. And she brought this thing back and said, "Dude, these are the shoes that they were wearing." And they began to go down that road, trying to tie that back. And, when we wear shoes, and most people, we're weird. Us forensics people are really weird. When you wear a shoe, if you're just a regular civilian, you don't think about your wear patterns. If you pronate or supinate, you roll your feet in, roll your feet out. You can have the same pair of shoes. Let's just say we've got Nike shoes, okay, and they come off of the same run, made of the same material. It's the same style. And you buy all those pairs. You can give them to a whole group of people, they're going to wear them. Well, even though they're the same, they're going to look different after a period of time. It's dependent upon the environment you wear them in, your neuromuscular responses, your weight. All these things are going to influence the pattern on the shoe. It's going to vary from person to person. And so it's a very nuanced methodology of conducting investigations. Unlike fingerprints, you could kind of say the same thing about tire treads as well, but shoes in particular, because it's a principle that we have in forensics called individualization, that thing is unique to you and how you utilize it during life.
In terms of the crime scene itself, when the police arrive and start to investigate, and it was, to me, it almost looked from an aerial view of the dwellings, was a little bit like a compound. People live within close proximity of each other. So how then do you, as investigators, assess the scene, prioritise where you go first? Do you go first with the first victims that were found? And how then do you set up a timeline as to who was killed first, especially when they're in close proximity?
The first two victims that were discovered, well, first off, it's two families. You've got the Rodens, and then you have the Wagners, who are the perpetrators. Okay. By the way, one of these cases still has yet to go to trial, the father. But anyway, when they wound up at Christopher Roden Sr.'s house, he's the patriarch of the Roden clan. They came to his house first because of the dogs. His former sister-in-law, who he still had a great relationship with, his former sister-in-law and his ex-wife, who lived right down the road from him. Matter of fact, he had built a house for his ex-wife. That's the kind of relationship that they had. They just couldn't live together anymore, but she had her own place. Prioritizing these cases, I think, is very important in the sense of you're looking for a pattern, but you're handicapped greatly because you start to work these things and you have no sense of order at all. You don't know when any of these went down. So the safest thing that you can do is containment of that scene and work them as they come along. And this is where manpower comes in, because this place, like I'd mentioned, is isolated. You've got a county sheriff's office that has limited resources. The coroner for this area is a GP, just a general practitioner that sees patients in his office. Can you imagine being this guy? You get summoned out to the scene and you can't take the measure of what you're seeing. So they wound up having to call in the state police, the Ohio State Police, which is good because you can assign teams to the bodies. And that's generally what you have to do, because it's too much of a burden for any one or two investigators to have to work all 8 bodies. And there's another thing that's going on with the Rodens. They didn't discover the last body until much later in the day. This gentleman that I described that was 7 miles away, living in a total isolation out there. I think that somebody had this kind of epiphanal moment where they're like, oh, wait, has anybody heard from him? We need to go check. And they roll out there and he's dead and he's been shot as well. And this is such a small rural location. You can imagine the panic that set in too. You're talking about a mass murder here. You don't know who's going to strike next. And it seems kind of randomized, but the one thing that everybody understood is this is all one family. Now, I don't think that, at least initially, they thought that the Wagners had done it. To your earlier point, they thought that this was some kind of cartel-related event, because who does this kind of thing? Pretty quickly, though, they understood if this had been a cartel, the kids would have been wiped out as well. They would not have left anybody. They're no respecter of persons. They would have come in and just eradicated them. So the fact that, when you're trying to build out this profile, and please keep in mind, I am not a criminal profiler at all. I know enough to be dangerous, I think. That someone has some level of empathy for the kids. If this was some cold-hearted beast that had come in and it was business, they would have eradicated everybody. And to that point, the mother of the child that was in question, she had recently given birth. I think she was postpartum.
It was 4 days old, I think. Was it the days-old baby?
Yeah, days old. I'm sorry. Again, I get confused with the dates and the times. But when she was executed, she was living at her mom's house with her 16-year-old brother was living there too. She's got the newborn in bed with her. And we later found out that her boyfriend, Jake Wagner, shot her and killed her. And he's the father of the child that was, being babysat by his mother. He actually admitted when he began to allocute to what he had done, he said, I took the baby and placed it next to Hannah's breast so the child could suckle even in death. How do you take the measure of that? I don't know. I mean, it's one of the most ghastly things I'd ever heard.
That wasn't his biological child, the baby.
Right. Yeah. And this child, she had conceived this child with another fellow. And, of course, I think that they looked at him initially. They looked at everybody, But, when you take the long view of this and you see it, you see all of the planning that went into this and the steps that they had taken, even the destruction of the weapons, where they had taken the weapons and had attempted to cut them up with a torch. They used them as anchor. They put them in blocks of concrete, set them out on what they refer to, I think I'm going to get this right, goose boxes. In a pond, they have these goose boxes out there where the geese can come in and lay their eggs and whatnot, and they'd use these as underwater anchors. It just, the longer the case went on, the nuttier it got, because the Wagners, they tried to portray themselves as victims. They had nothing to do with this. They had nothing but love for the rodents. And you go back and you look at kind of the histrionics of everything, and there's pictures of these two families together at public gatherings, okay? Church. They've got a huge, I think it's a Dogwood Festival they have every spring, which is like a market that gathers, and they have, clowns and carnival rides and all that sort of stuff. They're there together. These families knew one each other. And the mother, Wagner, she could not abide having anybody have control over her son. So when Jake tried to have a relationship with anybody, she would require that the female turn over her passwords for her social media. They wanted her to live with them, control everything that they did. And this even played out. The Wagners fled to Alaska, where they tried to start a new life up there. And of course, all the while, the police are watching them. Who decides to pull up stakes and move to Alaska? Not that Alaska is bad. I'm just saying your family has been here for generations. Prior to the Civil War, they were there. And so you're going to be on the radar. They knew they were on the radar. And Jake wound up being involved with another young lady in Alaska. And the same thing happened with her. She had to escape. She had to call somebody to come pick her up in a parking lot to spirit her away, because she was in fear of her life. She had gotten involved with Jake because the mother was doing the same thing with her. And I think at one point in time, Jake told her that he would kill her, that she had to abide by the rules of the family. So you've got all this stuff that's kind of interlaced with one another. But I'm sorry to prattle on, but, it's so complex. The forensics were very fascinating. All of these homes were mobile homes in one way or another. So you had the caravan that I'd mentioned with the one victim that was isolated, but the other homes were all mobile homes. Mama Roden, in her house, her ex-husband had built on an addition to it. And the reason I'm telling you this is, again, a first for me. They refitted these mobile homes with tires and removed the homes from the actual location where the events took place, and took the mobile homes down these country lanes to store them. It looked like a gigantic blimp hangar. It was like an old warehouse. And I think a lot of forensic value is lost doing that, because there's multiple gunshot wounds or multiple gunshots that are being fired in this place. So if you've ever been in a mobile home or a caravan camper, you know that they're not the most sturdy structures. And so even the slightest bend in these things can throw off any kind of trajectory that you're trying to pull, through a door, which one of the doors was shot through. Chris had splinters in his face where he got in a shower of these things because they had fired an SKS round, which is 7.62 by 39. That round came through the door, splintered the door facing, and he's got these little fragments of wood, in his face. So if you're trying to pull that trajectory and you haven't done it before the thing is moved, you're in trouble. So I couldn't necessarily understand the value of removing these things, but it was something that will be studied for a while. Was there any value in actually removing these things? They had argued at one point in time, well, they couldn't secure them. Okay, well, they're saying they can't provide security for them so that people can come back out. And interestingly enough, I think it was one of the news affiliates of one of the major networks. You could see the area was fenced off where they had stored these things, and they'd gone on and on about how they wanted to secure these structures. They took a picture of the gate where these things were, and it had a chain that was hanging on it and wasn't locked.
One of the things that really surprised me about this case was the extent of the planning and meticulous engineering that went into it. For example, a flatbed truck that they used. They actually went to the trouble of building a level that the two sons could hide under, and then covered that with hay. So when the father drove up, the family of victims had no idea that these two males were disguised in the truck with weapons. It didn't seem necessary. If you went in the middle of the night, it did not seem necessary to go to that extreme extent of buying a truck. And I get it that they then transferred the ownership to somebody else, so to throw police off the track there. But to go to that extent to disguise people seemed to me extremely bizarre.
Yeah, it is this false bed that essentially that they had created in there. And then it had little or no utility, all of that effort that they had put into this thing, because it was actually George Wagner III, who was the oldest son. He's Jake's older brother. He was the one that was supposed to pop out and shoot the senior, Chris Roden, and he lost his nerve. He couldn't fire. And, they go to these great lengths in order to set up almost like a portable blind in order to conduct an ambush so that they wouldn't give it away. A lot of the stuff that they did had little or no utility. It's like it was almost as if there was a lot of planning, but they didn't really understand application. You would think that something like this would come off as almost like a bad comparison, but almost like a symphony. Everybody knows their part. You enter at this point in time, you do this, and it kind of got jumbled up, so much so that, when the senior Wagner, who is Billy, and he says, listen, I encourage you to go look up images of this guy. He's terrifying. He looks like he's like 6'8". He's this behemoth guy. He comes out of the house after having killed Chris, and he says something to the effect, I just killed my best friend. And he's like, I can't do it. And it's Jake who is encouraging him now. Not really encouraging, he's admonishing him. He says, we're in this now. We're doing this. Imagine your son saying that to you. We're doing this now. Pull yourself together. Now we're going to go execute the next door neighbors, who is a child, and they've got the baby over there, the two kids. And you see Billy when he comes into court, and he dwarfs everybody that's around. The guy looks like an ogre. I mean, he's massive. And he had this flash temper. And here's kind of an interesting little aside. I don't know if anybody's heard this, but so the mother, Angela Wagner, married to Billy. She's the mother of Jake and George. She had this fascination with baskets. like gift baskets that look like old-fashioned picnic baskets. They have like a built-in patina to them. She would decorate with them. And Billy would become quite threatening in the home. He would just fly off the handle for any reason. And it was said that every time he would get angry, his way of apologizing to his wife was to go and buy her a basket. You walk into their kitchen, and the walls are covered with baskets, nailed to the wall, screwed into the walls, and then up on the cabinetry. You got them sitting up there. And you look at that and you try to understand that. You see that pathology, that psychopathology that's going on amongst all these people. A lot of anger, rage, and he's so very simplistic, that this is his peace offering to his wife every time he hurts her feelings or says something untoward. Simply in a basket, he's going to do this. And you get I think that's kind of an interesting insight into the way, their minds kind of worked. Very simplistic. They could think of these kind of higher constructs, but they didn't really understand application. Even if they did, and even if they were exacting as if there's some kind of fictional hitman that's out there, I don't know that in a space like this, in a community like this, that they could have actually gotten away with this. I don't know that there's enough planning you could have done, because it was such a massive undertaking to do this in one night. And I think many people sit back and they kind of scratch their heads over this thing and they wonder, why do you have to kill everybody? Why would you kill a young mother with a newborn? Why would you shoot her in the face? That seems like an obvious question, but I think it demands an answer. You have to try to understand these things. You don't want it repeated. It doesn't mean that it's not going to be repeated. It's just the cases, I hate to say case because it's not a singular case. Each one of these people represents a life. You try to make sense of it because, and I've said, and I even said on the podcast, Piketon Massacre, that look, 100 years from now, this case has affected this community so much. They've never had anything like this happen. This is the kind of case that kids are going to sit around a campfire 100 years from now, and they're going to tell tales about this thing. It's one of those things that kind of morphs into a ghost story because nothing like this had ever impacted that area. It can literally change the complexion of how a community gets on with life. I don't know that they'll ever recover from it.
Just in terms of the baskets, one thing I was thinking was I think it's interesting that the husband actually bought these baskets and things to get back into the mother's favour, and yet she was clearly the architect of the murders and so controlling of her sons. It's a very pathological relationship.
Boy, you're not kidding. I mean, can you imagine, if you're a psychiatrist, you could do an entire dissertation on these cases alone, just trying to understand, the psychopathology here involved in all of this. And I'm just an old forensics guy. I sit there and I think about, you can't help, some of that kind of spills over into, you're trying to assess the physical evidence and trying to understand it. But then you sit back and you're trying to attempt to understand everything in totality. And it's hard. It's certainly hard to make sense of. And I don't know that anybody ever would or ever will. It's like a lot of the mass shootings that we have here. You try to take the measure of it. And the worst question you can ask, I think, particularly for those of us in science, is why. Because why will drive you to madness. Years ago, we had something that was called the Buckhead Massacre in Atlanta. I think we had 16 people that were shot dead. It was a guy that was doing day trading. And he walks in, he had just killed his wife and his 2 kids and stuffed them in a closet, and then walked in and just killed everybody in the business, that was there, moved from business to business, while he's there, killed a lot of people, and wound up taking his own life eventually. It's a fool's errand to ask why. You can sit there and you can, opine all day long about why he did it, but you'll never have complete answers about it. It's easier for me to ask what, when, and how, and those sorts of things. You start to get off into who, and boy, it's a dark path you go down.
Sometimes the why may become apparent after, because as I understand it in the Piketon Massacre, what was the mother's undoing? She sort of meticulously planned so much, and yet shortly after the mother of the grandchild's murder, she produces this document that's notarized by her mother that has signing over custody to Jake if anything ever happened to her. And they claimed that this was a document that had been signed, reasonable time prior. And yet the police actually discovered that it was printed after the murders. That's what I was reading. Whether that's true or not.
No, it is. It's absolutely. I mean, one of the major charges here is fraud and forgery. So yeah, that's an element to this. And again, this goes back, Kathryn, to what's your goal here? Well, the goal was to have custody. It extends beyond the custody of this child. It's she wants to control everything in this universe. Everybody else be damned. I'm going to do what I want to do. This is my world. I've created it. And the darkness that's involved in this, the pure evil. I mean, because it truly is. I think about these babies that are left behind, Kathryn, and my heart just breaks for them because, many of them, like the newborn, sooner or later they're going to find out. You can't, particularly in the world that we're in now. My Lord, you're going to find out what happened, and those children are going to. They're going to have to arrive at their own conclusions about this. I wonder about the older child that said that dad was playing zombie, because that's imprinted in that precious child's brain. There's some of that left behind. I don't know how much that child will be scarred moving forward, but all for your own personal vanity. This idea that you want to control everything, that you're the empress or whatever it is of your world, and you dominate everybody there. The death penalty had been on the table for the males in particular, because she was not what we refer to as a trigger puller, even though she was the planner. It wasn't necessarily there for her, but Jake had to say that he would testify against his brother, which he wound up doing.
And as I understood it, the mother wanted all the others killed, partly as subterfuge, because if they just killed the young mother, who, by the way, was 15 when she started dating Jake.
I think, they were 15, but I think that they had actually met before that. I think they may have met when she was 13, and they started dating, when they're 15.
But if she were the only one killed from the family, well, then been obvious, and then the other family members who presumably had guns and things too would have sought retribution. So it was almost like a preventive measure, wiping everybody out.
Yeah, kind of like I was going to say retroactive event, but yeah, it was and again, an attempt, eradication of these people in order to put the investigators off scent, to snuff out these lives. And it's amazing that, what point in time do you get to this place in your mind where you're going to make this decision? You're going to take this leap off into the abyss. And they did. I'm going to be very interested moving forward to see how this is going to perhaps influence the way we handle cases in the future, particularly those that occur in rural locations. And, I know you guys have a lot of rural. You have more rural than most people in your lovely country. And, you think about having to handle cases like this in isolation. Just being able to secure the scenes, because there's multiple scenes, get that locked down. And what skill level are your investigators going to have in that area? Are you going to bring all the force to bear that's going to be necessary, because people are going to have questions? And, once you cross the threshold, walking into any of those trailers, any of those mobile homes, you can't do that for the first time again. You have to be completely prepared for, when you step off. And I'm glad you brought up the images that you saw, the so-called compound. You see all the rusted cars, just is like a graveyard for old vehicles. And all that stuff's been removed now. I've been there twice now. I've been up to all 4 of the locations. All that stuff's removed now. Of course, the trailers are long gone. But one kind of poignant thing that was adjacent to Chris's home, Chris Roden's house, is where his son lived with his wife. And those two kids lived in that trailer. Did you know last time I was up there, the wooden steps that had been built and the little landing that goes up to the mobile home is, one of these prefab things that you can just push up, and you've got steps, exterior steps, and a landing. I remember standing there, and it was very cold out, and I was just kind of taking the view. But there on that little landing were children's toys just sitting there, plastic, worn, weathered, abandoned. And then Chris's barn was still there. By the way, Jake had gone in there to remove the digital hard drives because they had surveillance equipment up there, and all that stuff had been detached. Chris's barn, there was still a information poster that was all weathered that had been slapped on the side of that barn when the killings took place. And over time now, through the snow and the rain and the cold and the heat, you could still walk up to it and make up the images of every one of those family members that had been murdered. And you could still see it there as like this testament that kind of reached out and screamed at you, in that quiet, beautiful place, that this had occurred. It's like everything else in life, sooner or later that's going to disappear, and, no one will have a memory, perhaps. Well, they will have a memory, but all of the physical things that were there that made it up are gone now.
Joseph, this has been an incredible conversation. Thank you so much for all of your time.
You guys are so generous. Thank you, guys.
Crime Insiders Forensics is a LiSTNR original production. It's hosted by me, Kathryn Fox. Production team includes Holly Mitchell, Link Kelly, and Jade Murray. Executive producer is Dan Mullins.